When a quiet widow in a small Vermont town uncovers a locked safe in her attic, she assumes it holds little more than trinkets left behind by the man she loved for decades. But as she finally opens it, one shocking revelation changes everything and sets off a desperate race to uncover the truth, one that could unravel a well-respected legacy. Before we dive into this story of hidden confessions, moral reckonings, and the courage to face the darkest secrets of a loved one's past, let us know where you're reading from. And if you believe that truth, no matter how painful, can pave the way to healing, consider giving this story a like and subscribing for more. Diane Whitmore's hands trembled as she placed the last photograph into a cardboard box. Light filtered through the lace curtains of her cozy living room, illuminating the dust motes drifting in the air. She was in the midst of a chore that no one ever wanted, sorting through the belongings of her recently departed husband, Paul. He had died suddenly of a heart attack just 3 weeks before, leaving Diane in a fog of grief she had yet to pierce. Their home in rural Vermont, surrounded by pine trees and rolling hills, felt eerily silent without the gentle hum of his Sunday radio show or the shuffle of his slippers on the hardwood floors. At 72, Diane was old enough to have weathered life storms, but this one felt especially cruel. Paul had been her rock, a man of calm conviction, the sort of husband whose very presence could soothe the day's troubles. Everyone who knew him remembered him as a proud Vietnam veteran turned dedicated history professor at a local college. A man who taught from the heart and cherished the quiet joys of reading on the porch, mowing the lawn in the early morning dew, or sharing dinner with Diane. He had earned numerous accolades for his teaching, and at each year's graduation ceremony, former students approached him with gratitude. Yet all those memories were overshadowed by the savage pang of his absence. Diane dabbed her eyes with a tissue, exhaling slowly as she sealed the box of photographs. She'd spent the morning going through his study, labeling items to be kept, donated, or handed down to extended family. In the corner of the study stood a stack of books about the Vietnam War, Paul's well-worn references, pages stuffed with notes, edges softened by years of use. She traced her fingers over their spines, recalling how he'd once said those texts helped him grapple with the war's aftermath. Back then, she hadn't pressed him for details. If he wanted to share, he would. He rarely did. After a break for tea, she decided to tackle the attic. The notion of rummaging through that dusty, dimly lit space filled her with a strange mix of dread and nostalgia. She climbed the creaking ladder, each step a small protest from aging wood. The attic's single bulb cast shadows over piles of old furniture, out-of-season clothes, and boxes containing keepsakes from a lifetime shared. As she carefully shifted some boxes aside, her hip brushed against the far wall, producing a hollow thump. Curious, she tapped it again. The sound was off, like there was empty space behind the paneling. Frowning, she ran her hand along the wall until she discovered a seam, a nearly invisible line that suggested the presence of a hidden compartment. Her pulse quickened. Why had Paul concealed something here? With gentle prying, she loosened the panel just enough to slide it aside, revealing a small metal safe nestled behind the wall. Dust coated its surface, indicating it had been there a long time. Diane's breath caught as she stared at the combination dial. She was no stranger to safes. She and Paul had once kept an old lockbox for valuables. But this was new to her, or rather, old and unknown. Why had Paul never mentioned it? She tried the usual birthdays, hers, his, their wedding date, but the safe refused to open. Feeling foolish yet determined, she descended to Paul's study to search for clues. She flipped through drawers, old receipts, even the inside covers of his favorite books. After nearly an hour, she uncovered a slip of paper tucked in the back of his desk, listing 6 digits that didn't immediately ring a bell. Hoping against hope, she returned to the attic and spun the dial according to those numbers. To her astonishment, the lock clicked. With trembling fingers, she swung the safe's door open. A short stack of papers and a single leather-bound journal lay inside, along with a small zippered pouch. The topmost paper was a yellowed certificate, an official discharge document from the Army, which Diane recognized. Beneath it, though, was an envelope labeled Echo Lantern. She set that aside, intrigued, and picked up the leather-bound journal. Its cover was scuffed, corners worn, as if it had traveled many miles. Carefully, she opened it to the first page, date marked as September 12, 1969. She read the opening lines. They said it would be quick, in and out. No one said it would burn into my soul. A shiver coursed through Diane's body. Her husband's familiar handwriting filled each subsequent line, but the words felt like a stranger's confessions. She flipped a few pages, noticing repeated references to an operation in Vietnam, codenamed Echo Lantern, something involving a covert mission that turned disastrous. The journal entries were dense with raw emotion, detailing how Paul, then just 24, had been part of a special intelligence unit assigned to strike a Viet Cong stronghold in a remote village. But something had gone horribly wrong. Civilians, a massacre, a cover-up. Diane's heart pounded. She read in fragments, tears gathering. Phrases like, "I can't wash the blood from my hands," and "we were ordered to do it or be court-martialed ourselves," jumped out. He wrote of burying the memory, of carrying guilt like a stone in his chest. This was not the Paul she knew. He had occasionally mentioned the war in broad, regretful terms, how conflict shaped men, how horrors lurked in every war. But he never specified such atrocities. Her hands shook so violently that she had to pause and place the journal on her lap. Her beloved husband had been part of an unspeakable war crime? A wave of nausea flooded her. She closed her eyes, imagining Paul as a young soldier, trapped by the chain of command, forced to commit the unthinkable. That was half a century ago. Had he carried this secret his entire life? Her grief over losing him merged with a new, jarring sense of betrayal. Or perhaps it was sorrow at how he'd lived with such anguish alone. She skimmed more pages. The final entry, dated just weeks before his heart attack, read, "I can't leave this earth without confessing. Diane deserves to know, though I can't bear to tell her face to face. If she finds this journal, I hope she understands that I was just a scared kid, following orders I knew were wrong. I've spent every day since trying to atone in small ways. But how do you atone for that?" Diane clutched the journal to her chest, tears rolling down her cheeks. She felt a deep, wrenching ache for the man she loved, a kind father, an inspiring professor, who had quietly been at war with his past. She closed the safe, taking the journal downstairs with her, mind racing with questions. She had discovered a horrifying truth about her husband's younger self. Now, what was she to do with that knowledge? By the time she settled into bed that night, the journal lay on her nightstand like a silent weight. She tried to sleep, but nightmares of gunfire and screaming villagers plagued her mind. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, sheets damp with sweat. She forced herself up, brewed a pot of coffee, and reread the early entries. She gleaned that the covert operation had been codenamed Echo Lantern, orchestrated by a clandestine group within the military intelligence community. The official mission was to flush out Viet Cong fighters hidden among the locals, but leadership demanded zero tolerance. Anyone in the village was labeled an enemy. Paul described a scene of chaos, of confusion, of young soldiers who realized too late that many of the people in their sights were unarmed, innocent. Commanders, worried about negative press and public backlash, buried the evidence, forging after-action reports to make it look like a legitimate engagement. The guilt consumed Paul, and he recorded it in scattered entries throughout the war and after. She recognized his disciplined penmanship devolving into angry scribbles whenever he referenced the children. He had carried it alone, evidently fearing retaliation if he spoke. According to one entry, he attempted to reveal the truth after he returned stateside, but a man from the intelligence unit threatened him with dire consequences for his family if he talked. So he stayed silent, built a life, taught about history's lessons, and tried to do good wherever he could. Diane wept. She felt protective of Paul, knowing he was just a terrified kid forced into unimaginable brutality. Yet she also felt a deep horror at the act itself. If this came to light, would the world see him as a monster, or as a victim of a monstrous system? She set the journal aside, tears streaming, whispering, "My God, Paul, why couldn't you trust me to help you carry this?" The next day, She busied herself with chores and tried not to dwell on the newly uncovered secret. Yet she couldn't ignore it. She felt an almost physical pressure in her chest, a silent demand from Paul's last confession. He wanted her to know, but had he wanted her to keep it hidden or to reveal it? The entries were ambiguous. Regret, a desire for truth to surface, but also fear of destroying everything. She recalled how he had once championed the importance of confronting uncomfortable historical truths, urging his students to study not just victories but war crimes and injustices. Could she do any less now that it involved him? Her phone rang that afternoon. She answered, half distracted. A voice spoke, deep, unfamiliar. "Mrs. Whitmore," it said, "we're sorry for your loss. We also know you found something that belongs to Paul." Chills ran up her spine. "Who is this?" she asked, voice trembling. There was a pause. "For your own sake, forget it ever existed." The line clicked dead. She stared at the phone, heart hammering. Someone out there knew about the journal. Echo Lantern might still be under wraps, even decades later. Could the same people who had threatened Paul be watching her now? She locked the doors, pulling curtains shut, fear mounting. If they threatened her, then they might threaten others she cared about. Who could she turn to? Her son, Daniel, came to mind. They hadn't been close for some time. He was a former investigative journalist who had once chased a whistleblower story that nearly cost him his reputation. The stress and disillusionment caused him to pivot careers and drift from Diane. But now, faced with a conspiracy bigger than she could handle alone, she needed him. She dialed Daniel's number, leaving a short message. "Honey, I need you. It's about your father. Please call me back." Daniel arrived 2 days later, rapping lightly on the front door. Diane opened it to see her 37-year-old son standing there with a haunted expression. He wore a worn leather jacket, his hair longer than she remembered, and lines of worry etched on his face. "Mom," he said, wrapping her in an embrace. She felt the tension in his shoulders. "What's going on?" She led him to the kitchen, where she'd laid out coffee and a plate of shortbread cookies, comfort in the midst of turmoil. At first, Daniel was skeptical. "Dad committed a war crime? That's impossible," he said, pacing. But as Diane produced the journal, he flipped through the pages, eyes widening with each paragraph. By the time he reached the end, tears rimmed his gaze. "I spent my childhood idolizing him," he murmured. "He never let on about any of this." Diane revealed the phone call she'd received. Fear flickered in Daniel's eyes. He recognized the patterns. A secret faction within the government or military, protecting old skeletons from the Vietnam era. He admitted he once chased a lead involving a cover-up in a different war scenario, only to have his sources vanish under suspicious pressure. That fiasco cost him credibility and ended his journalism career. Now, his father's hidden confession threatened to pull him back into the same world of shadows and intimidation. Yet how could he ignore it? After hours of discussion, they decided to investigate further. They would proceed carefully, discreetly. If Echo Lantern was as big and damning as Paul's journal suggested, the forces behind it might be formidable. They also recognized the moral weight. To bury the journal would be to let the massacre remain unspoken, denying justice for the victims. But to expose it would tarnish Paul's legacy and invite potential retaliation. Diane, feeling torn, told Daniel she believed Paul ultimately wanted the truth out. He was a historian who taught that uncovering the past was necessary for healing. Hiding the journal would betray that principle. The following day, they pored over Paul's notes to glean more details about Echo Lantern, dates, names, possible leads. One entry mentioned a fellow soldier nicknamed Sharky, who expressed horror at the operation and later vanished. Another referred to a Colonel Reeves, described as cunning and ruthless, who orchestrated the official cover-up. The diaries listed coordinates of the village in Vietnam, describing the day it was attacked. Men, women, children, no mercy shown. Daniel felt queasy reading it, stepping away at intervals to gather his composure. Diane fought tears each time she encountered a reference to children. They discovered that Paul had once tried to contact a government official about it. He typed up a statement but never sent it, presumably after receiving threats. One cryptic note read, "They threatened you, Diane and Daniel. I couldn't risk it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "They threatened me as a baby," he whispered, anger surging. He stayed silent for our sake. That night, while Daniel dozed in the guest room, Diane couldn't sleep. She roamed the house, memories of Paul flooding her. She flicked on the living room lamp, eyes landing on a photo of him in his army uniform, young and serious. How many nights had he lain awake, haunted by guilt? She whispered to the photo, "You should have told me. We could have faced it together." But she understood. Some burdens felt too large to share, especially when loved ones might become targets. The next morning, Diane and Daniel scoured public military records for references to Echo Lantern. As expected, they found nothing. The operation was deeply classified. Daniel's old journalistic instincts kicked in. He made discreet calls to ex-colleagues, describing it as a hypothetical scenario to gauge if anyone recognized the code name. Most responded with confusion or suspicion. Finally, a single contact emailed Daniel. "Heard rumors about a hush-hush unit in Nam. If it's what I suspect, watch your back. They bury this stuff deep." They needed more direct leads. One name from the journal stood out: Staff Sergeant Mitch Rourke. Paul had described him as a reluctant participant who might have tried to gather evidence. If Rourke was alive, maybe he could confirm the story. The diaries hinted that Rourke moved frequently, possibly hiding from the same threat that silenced Paul. Daniel spent hours chasing digital breadcrumbs, searching for a Mitchell Rourke who served in Vietnam. They eventually found an address in upstate New York linked to a man in his 70s, a known recluse. It was a slim chance, but worth trying. Diane insisted on going with Daniel. The caretaker inside her wanted to ensure Daniel didn't face danger alone, and she felt compelled to see if Rourke had known her husband's darkest secret. Daniel argued against it, citing potential threats, but Diane refused to be sidelined. She reminded him that she was Paul's wife, that she had a right to see this through. Reluctantly, he agreed. They drove across rural roads for hours, each mile echoing with tension. Daniel worried about being followed. Diane peered into the rearview mirror repeatedly, seeing only occasional trucks or farm vehicles. She tapped her foot anxiously, the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel roads pressing her nerves. They arrived at a remote property ringed by overgrown weeds and a rusted mailbox. The house was a small, sagging structure with faded paint. Daniel parked and they approached cautiously. An elderly man emerged onto the porch, rifle in hand. "Get off my property," he yelled, voice rough. Daniel raised his hands, calling out that they just wanted to talk about Vietnam. The man's eyes narrowed. Diane noticed the tension in his stance, a wariness born from years of isolation. She stepped forward, calling softly, "We mean no harm. We just want to ask about Echo Lantern." The man froze, rifle lowering slightly. "Who are you?" he demanded. They explained that Diane was the widow of Paul Whitmore, who had participated in Echo Lantern. She held up a page from the journal, bearing a line referencing Rourke. The man's face darkened. "I haven't heard that name in decades," he muttered. Slowly, he told them to come inside, pointing the rifle away but not discarding it. The interior was cluttered, with newspapers and dusty furniture, as if he rarely had visitors. Once they sat down, the tension in the air felt thick. Rourke confirmed he was indeed the staff sergeant from that cursed operation. He had tried to blow the whistle after the war, but men in suits threatened him. They told him accidents happened to traitors. He retreated, drifting off the grid. When Diane mentioned Paul's name, Rourke's weathered features flickered with recognition. "Yeah, I remember Whitmore. He was a professor type even back then, always reading. Hated what we did, what we were forced to do." Rourke's eyes glistened with old pain. "We were kids, you know? We didn't have a choice. But that doesn't absolve us. I still see their faces." Diane showed him Paul's journal. Rourke read the excerpt describing the day of the massacre. Tears slipped down his cheeks. "He told the truth," he whispered. Then he sighed. "There's more. That day we weren't even attacked. We stormed in on false intel. They told us the Viet Cong was using the village as a base, but we found only civilians. It was a slaughter, orchestrated by officers who wanted results and didn't care how. Once it was done, they burned the huts, staged weapons near the bodies. We were told to sign NDAs, sworn to secrecy. He paused, jaw clenched. I tried to gather proof, a few photos, but they found them. That was the end of it. They threatened my entire family. Daniel asked if Rourke would speak publicly. The old man hesitated. I'm near the end of my life. Part of me wants to unburden this, but I'm tired of running. Those men might still have connections. When Diane insisted the victims deserve truth, tears welled again in Rourke's eyes. They do, he whispered, voice cracking. But I paid too high a price for trying once. He eventually agreed to share his testimony if Diane and Daniel found a credible channel that could protect him and ensure the story didn't vanish. Diane felt both gratitude and fear. This was bigger than she'd realized. Driving home, they mulled over what Rourke had said. The massacre was systematically covered up. The chain of command had orchestrated it. A man named Colonel Reeves was singled out in Paul's notes as the key figure. Was Reeves still alive? Another name emerged in the diaries. A certain Major Garrison, who might have been involved. Daniel decided to dig further, contacting old media colleagues who specialized in war crime documentation. Meanwhile, Diane secured the journal in a locked drawer, triple-checking the house's security. She half expected another menacing phone call. Sure enough, that night, Diane's landline rang again. A different voice or the same disguised? She couldn't tell. We know you've been speaking to Rourke, it said. Stop. This won't end well for you. She tried to respond, but the line went dead. Her hands shook as she replaced the receiver. She dreaded that they might escalate from calls to something worse. Daniel insisted they involve law enforcement, but they had no idea who might be compromised. Detective agencies or official channels could leak to the wrong people, especially if those behind Echo Lantern had influence. Diane had only one person she somewhat trusted, an old friend of Paul's from his college days, Malcolm, who'd once served in the Senate. He was retired now but might have connections. She phoned Malcolm, explaining only that she had urgent information about a Vietnam operation. He agreed to meet discreetly. They drove to a diner on the edge of the next county, a quiet place where the hum of traffic was minimal. Malcolm, a tall man in his 70s, sipped black coffee as he listened. When Diane revealed the gist of the journal's content, Malcolm's expression darkened. I'd heard rumors of something like this, but I never had proof. If you come forward, you'll stir a hornet's nest. Still, he admitted that a few legal nonprofits specialized in war crimes. They might handle it carefully, ensuring the safety of witnesses. He gave them a contact at an organization called the Global Justice Coalition, GJC. They're bulldogs, Malcolm said. If they get hold of credible evidence, they'll push for an official inquiry. Diane felt her stomach twist. Taking that step would almost guarantee national attention. Paul's name might be dragged through the mud. His memory, once revered, could become infamous. Yet what was the alternative? Hiding the evidence would betray the dead villagers and possibly embolden those who threatened her. She stared into her coffee cup, recalling the lines in Paul's final entry, how he prayed she'd understand. Daniel rested a hand on her shoulder, eyes gentle. We'll do it together, he said softly. They decided on a plan. Gather as much documentation as possible, including Rourke's testimony, then approach the GJC. Meanwhile, Daniel would try to confirm whether Colonel Reeves or Major Garrison were still alive. If so, their involvement might still matter. Over the following days, they used old telephone directories, online forums for veterans, even genealogical databases. They discovered that Colonel Reeves had died in the 1990s, but Major Garrison was rumored to live in Florida. They found no direct address, only a rumor from a military forum. They left messages on relevant boards, hoping to glean more. Each step carried the risk of tipping off watchful eyes. Sure enough, another phone call arrived, this time more explicit. Mrs. Whitmore, you're meddling in matters beyond you, the voice warned. We protected your husband for decades. Do you want to ruin his legacy and your own life? Diane's fear turned to anger. "Paul never asked for your protection," she hissed. "He was blackmailed into silence." The caller hung up. Her heart pounded, but she refused to give in. Determined to press on, Diane and Daniel arranged a final meeting with Rourke to record his statement on video, ensuring they had clear evidence. They did so in a motel room using Daniel's camera. The ex-soldier, hands shaking, recounted the events of that day in Vietnam. How the orders came down, how the unit realized too late they were slaughtering innocents, how the brass threatened them all with dire consequences if they spoke out. As he finished, tears ran down the old man's face. "I can still see them," he whispered. "It haunts my dreams." The next day, Diane, Daniel, and Rourke planned to send the footage and the journal to the GJC. But the morning of their scheduled handover, Rourke failed to show up. Daniel tried calling him, no answer. Fearful, they drove to his house, only to find the door ajar, the interior ransacked. Rourke was gone, presumably taken or forced to flee. Bloodstains near the entrance testified to a struggle. Horrified, Diane called 911, and local police arrived. A detective assured them they'd investigate. Daniel and Diane quietly withheld mention of Echo Lantern, worried about infiltration. Shaken, they realized the danger was escalating. Rourke's disappearance hammered home that powerful forces were determined to keep Echo Lantern buried. They had, however, the recorded testimony from just the day before. Rourke's face, voice, and words were safely on Daniel's laptop and backed up to a secure drive. Diane vowed that if these men had hurt or kidnapped Rourke, she would not let his testimony vanish. She felt guilt for dragging him out of hiding, but also knew he wanted the truth revealed. On the drive back, Daniel admitted he felt partially responsible. "Maybe I shouldn't have involved him so directly," he muttered. Diane, eyes wet, insisted it was Miss Sanderson's or Miss Colonel Reeves's or the hidden group's wrongdoing. They were the criminals, not them. "We just want the truth," she said. "They're the ones committing crimes even now." Under the cloak of night, Daniel contacted the GJC, describing the documents and video. The group's lead counsel, a woman named Harriet Lane, promised safe channels to share the information. Diane and Daniel drove to Harriet's office in Boston, a tall, nondescript building near the water. They took the elevator to a mid-level floor, hearts pounding with each ding. Harriet greeted them in a small conference room, posture brisk but kind. She reviewed some of the evidence, eyes narrowing at the scope of the alleged war crime. "This is huge," Harriet said softly. "We can't guarantee no blowback, but we'll do everything to protect you and your father's story. This must be investigated." That night, Diane stared at the city lights outside her hotel window, the ache of missing Paul heavier than ever. She pictured him as a young soldier, confused and horrified, following catastrophic orders. She pictured him as the older professor, guiding students through historical lessons in an effort to right some cosmic wrong. Tomorrow, Harriet would break the story to key media contacts who specialized in war investigations. Diane wrestled with guilt, imagining Paul's face on the news, overshadowed by atrocity. But she also recalled the final line in his diary. "I only found some measure of peace by teaching the next generation that truth must not be silenced." At dawn, Harriet moved swiftly. She had a short press briefing with major outlets, sharing redacted portions of the journal, referencing codename Echo Lantern, the approximate date and location of the massacre, and the existence of living witnesses. She withheld Diane and Daniel's names for their protection, at least initially. Within hours, Twitter and online news portals buzzed with shock. An alleged Vietnam War massacre that was never reported, overshadowed even by the recognized My Lai atrocity. Anonymous sources in the military claimed ignorance or confusion, but Harriet's group hammered the details, citing diaries and partial documents. The story caught fire. Diane and Daniel returned home to Vermont, watching the media frenzy unfold on their TV. Journalists begged for interviews. Harriet fielded requests, shielding Diane for the time being. But Diane felt it was only a matter of time before Paul's name surfaced. Sure enough, after 2 days, a major network identified Paul Whitmore as the soldier whose journal had ignited the scandal. The phone rang incessantly. Some messages expressed sympathy, others spewed venom. calling Paul a murderer. Diane's chest tightened with each hateful accusation, but she clung to the knowledge that Paul had been forced, that he'd spent his life trying to atone. She also kept a protective watch over her door, worried about more sinister forms of retaliation. Yet no further calls came from the threatening voice, as if their adversaries were regrouping. Possibly, they realized the story was out and there was no reversing it. The GJC's lawyers demanded an official government inquiry. Politicians scrambled, some dismissing the allegations, others calling for transparency. The Defense Department announced they were reviewing archival records, a typical euphemism for stalling. But the press, galvanized by the GJC and Harriet's relentless push, refused to let it drop. Additional veterans emerged, sharing partial recollections that seemed to corroborate the event. Colonel Reeves was dead, but some old subordinates stepped forward, anonymously confirming the hush-up. As the evidence piled on, the U.S. government could no longer ignore it. Amid the chaos, Diane felt raw. She scrolled through online comments, some supportive, thanking her for her bravery, others condemning her for tarnishing a hero's name. She sobbed, clutching a photograph of her wedding day. Daniel tried to comfort her, but he too was reeling, forced to reconcile the father he loved with the soldier he never knew. In a moment of quiet, Diane said, "He was both, Daniel. He was good, but also did something terrible. People can be complicated." Then came a phone call that changed everything again. Harriet told them the government had tentatively acknowledged the existence of an Echo Lantern mission. They were launching an internal review. Harriet believed an official statement might be forthcoming. Diane exhaled a shaky breath. "This is what Paul wanted," she murmured, "for the truth to finally see the light." The next week, the White House press secretary delivered a brief statement. Newly uncovered records suggested that, indeed, in the Vietnam War era, certain units may have conducted unsanctioned operations leading to civilian casualties. An apology of sorts was promised, along with an inquiry to identify potential war crimes. Families of Vietnamese victims would be contacted for possible reparations. The media latched onto it, describing how a single soldier's posthumous confession had rocked decades of official silence. Late that night, Diane found herself alone with the journal, flipping pages aimlessly. So many entries cried out for redemption. She remembered how Paul used to stand at the lectern in his classroom, passionately discussing moral complexities in historical conflicts. Now she understood. He had wrestled with moral complexity every day of his life. Outside, the Vermont wind sighed through pine branches, as if mourning. Diane closed her eyes, whispering thanks that his secret, though devastating, might finally bring some measure of justice. Over the subsequent months, the story continued to develop. The GJC filed a formal request for restitution and acknowledgement on behalf of the massacre survivors. News outlets interviewed old Vietnamese villagers who still bore scars, some literal, some invisible. Anonymous officials confirmed that multiple attempts had been made to keep Echo Lantern hidden. Meanwhile, a slow groundswell of sympathy built for Paul, painting him not as a monster, but as a man conscripted into an unforgivable order who had tried to salvage his life afterward. Letters poured into Diane's mailbox, some hateful, many empathetic. One from a veterans group read, "We stand with you in shining truth upon the darkest corners. Your husband was our brother, flawed but brave for speaking now." Eventually, talk of a memorial or official recognition emerged. The U.S. government, under pressure, agreed to meet with survivors. A small delegation traveled to Vietnam. Harriet invited Diane to join, suggesting that her presence as Paul's widow could be significant. Diane hesitated. Her fear of stepping onto Vietnamese soil, the scene of Paul's nightmare, was daunting. But she also felt a calling. She needed to see the village where the horror occurred, to pay respects, to bridge a gap that had festered for decades. Daniel, now re-energized in his writing, insisted on accompanying her. "We can do this together," he said, voice unwavering. They flew out with Harriet and a handful of war crime investigators. The flight felt surreal, hours to reflect on how a locked safe in her attic had led to this. Once they landed, they traveled by bus to the rural province. Lush green fields and distant mountains greeted them. The humidity wrapped around Diane like a heavy cloak, each breath reminding her she was far from home. They arrived at a small village that had partly modernized but still bore older scars. The local inhabitants eyed them with polite curiosity and wariness. A translator guided them to a meeting hall, where a handful of elders and survivors awaited. One of them, a woman named Lon, had corresponded with GJC about her memories of the massacre. She had been a young girl then, losing her entire family. Diane's heart raced as she stepped forward, uncertain how to face someone whose life Paul had indirectly destroyed. But Lon, her eyes filled with sorrow and compassion, held out her hand. Through the translator, she said, "Thank you for coming. Thank you for not letting the truth stay buried." Tears slipped from Diane's eyes. She apologized, feeling the words too small. "My husband carried guilt for decades," she managed. "He tried to atone, though he kept it secret. I'm so sorry it took so long for this to surface." Lon nodded, tears glistening in her own eyes. She explained how she'd searched records for years, hearing only rumors and denials. Now, at last, there was an official acknowledgement, some measure of vindication. The elders had erected a modest memorial to the fallen, a stone pillar with names etched. Now, with the government's confirmation, the memorial would be updated, recognized. Diane realized that a small step of closure was possible. In a simple ceremony, Harriet presented official statements from U.S. authorities, pledging compensation to families and erecting a new plaque. Diane and Lon stood side by side, heartbreak woven in the space between them. Together, they planted a small tree near the stone monument, symbolizing life out of death, truth from decades of lies. They placed a temporary plaque, reading, "For the lives lost, and the truths that took too long to be told." Diane's chest constricted as she recalled Paul's final wish for redemption. Perhaps this was it, in some form. The two women embraced, tears mixing with the thick, humid air. Onlookers watched quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment. When Diane and Daniel returned to Vermont, a sense of peace accompanied them. Not that the past was erased, but the burden was lighter. Their personal bond grew stronger, the wall of estrangement chipped away by shared purpose. Daniel decided to write again, a long-form article or possibly a book, capturing the journey from discovering Paul's journal to the inquiry's aftermath. He wanted to highlight the complexities of guilt, war, and the love that still endured. Diane gave him her blessing. She even shared some personal letters from Paul, glimpses of how he tried to be a good father despite the hidden shame. In the weeks that followed, the official inquiry concluded with a formal condemnation of Echo Lantern. The government recognized the war crimes committed and promised to provide support to survivors. Some cynics called it a hollow gesture half a century too late. But for families like Lan's, it meant something. Paul Whitmore's name cropped up in countless articles and talk shows. The discussion around him was mixed. Some indicted him as a war criminal, others painted him as a tragic figure forced by a brutal system. Diane wept often, but each time, she reminded herself that Paul had chosen to reveal the truth, even posthumously. She believed he deserved some measure of mercy in public opinion, and Harriet's team helped shape that narrative. Paul was a haunted soldier who never stopped trying to atone. Diane found her own path forward. She began volunteering at a local veterans center, offering support to ex-soldiers who grappled with hidden traumas. She discovered an almost cathartic purpose, listening to stories of men and women who needed an empathetic ear. Some recognized her from the news, but none judged her husband harshly. They too carried secrets, nightmares. She realized how many veterans lived in silent torment, longing for understanding. The center's counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Karen, saw in Diane a depth of compassion that helped break down walls. Diane took it as a quiet tribute to Paul, to help others find their truth without waiting until it was too late. Months passed. Seasons changed. The press moved on to new headlines, but the Echo Lantern story remained a reference point in discussions about war ethics and accountability. The GJC's final report credited Paul's journal as the catalyst. Harriet visited Diane once more, expressing gratitude for her bravery. The final lines of Harriet's own press statement read, Sometimes the greatest acts of courage arise long after the battlefield has gone quiet. Daniel published his article online, receiving an outpouring of responses. He wrote about his father's complexity: kind teacher, loving dad, reluctant participant in a horrific act. He wrote about how a single false wall in an attic had separated a revered figure from a chilling secret. The piece concluded with a tribute to the power of truth. We do not excuse the crime, but we can hold love and condemnation in the same hand. It is only by confronting the full story that we heal. It went viral, prompting discussions in social media circles about the nuance of moral responsibility. In the quiet of her Vermont home, Diane felt a sense of closure forming. She stood in Paul's study one last time, carefully placing the journal in a box labeled Whitmore Memories. She had copies saved digitally, and Harriet had the original for safekeeping. She looked at the framed pictures of Paul with his students, wearing his usual gentle smile. For decades, he'd masked an inner torment with that smile. Now, she prayed he found peace in the afterlife. She brushed her fingertips over the frame. "I forgive you," she whispered, "and I love you." In the final days of autumn, Diane received an invitation from Lon. A simple letter, penned in Vietnamese but translated by Harriet's contact, inviting Diane to visit the village whenever she wished to see how the new memorial had grown. They had added more names discovered through local records. A new stone carving told the story of how, thanks to a soldier's confession, the tragedy was finally recognized. Diane wept at the thought of traveling back so soon. She realized she might return someday, but not now. The first visit had taken all her emotional strength. She wrote a heartfelt response, thanking Lon for her grace. The sun set earlier each evening, golden light washing the Vermont hills. On one such evening, Daniel joined Diane on the porch, a crisp wind blowing leaves across the yard. They sipped warm cider, reflecting on the extraordinary upheaval they had endured. "Do you ever regret exposing it all?" Daniel asked quietly, swirling the cider in his mug. Diane considered. "Some days, I wish Paul's memory could remain unblemished. But then I remember those families in Vietnam, the child survivors who never knew why their loved ones died so violently. If we hid this, we'd be complicit." I think, in his heart, Paul wanted the truth to come out, even if it took this long. Daniel nodded, eyes moist. "I'm proud of you, Mom. Of us. We faced it. Dad would have been proud, too." They lapsed into companionable silence, watching as the sky blazed orange, then faded to purple. In that hush, Diane felt a strange tranquility, as though the final chord of a tumultuous symphony had resolved. Paul's secret had threatened to unravel her entire life, but instead, it forged a deeper bond with her son, spurred a national reckoning, and opened a path for healing among those who had long yearned for closure. In time, as winter approached, Diane started volunteering more at the Veterans Center. She spoke gently with older men who wept over regrets, with younger ones haunted by more recent conflicts. She learned to listen without judgment. Some recognized her from the news. They asked about Paul's story. She told them, softly, that the best legacy a soldier can leave is not a perfect record, but an honest confrontation of the past, striving to spare future generations from the same mistakes. The men nodded, tears in their eyes. And so, life settled into a new rhythm. The partial hush of the Whitmore home no longer felt suffocating. Diane invited neighbors over for tea, reconnected with old friends. She strolled in the yard, tidying Paul's small garden. She no longer jumped at phone calls. The threats had ceased after the story went mainstream, and ironically, the publicity proved to be their shield. Those who once silenced Paul found themselves powerless against the unstoppable wave of truth. Before the first snowfall, Diane placed a small memorial stone in her backyard, next to the hydrangea bush Paul had loved. She had it carved with his name, birth and death dates, and a brief line, "Historian, husband, father, loved in truth." She stood there, letting the cold wind nip at her cheeks, recalling the man who taught her so much about kindness, who harbored a burden that crushed his soul. "We did it together, my love," she whispered. In the spring, as new leaves unfurled, Daniel visited again, this time with a glint of optimism in his eyes. He was working on a full-length book, the Echo-Lantern Papers, weaving together not just Paul's story, but also Rourke's and the Vietnamese survivors' perspectives. Harriet agreed to help secure a publisher. Daniel's passion for journalistic integrity had reignited. Diane saw in him a reflection of Paul's dedication to knowledge, though Daniel carried it with a renewed moral clarity. They strolled around the yard, discussing possible chapters. Daniel mentioned that Harriet's legal actions had led to a small reparation fund for the Vietnamese survivors. Lon had received enough support to rebuild a school in the village. She wrote that they hung a photo of you and Dad at the entrance, Daniel said, voice thick with emotion. Said it's a reminder that even an enemy can become a source of healing. Diane's throat tightened. She blinked away tears. She pictured that battered village, now seeing hope sprout from the wreckage. She pictured a new generation of kids, learning in a building that might exist partly because of Paul's confession. The magnitude of it all overwhelmed her. That's what I call a legacy, she murmured. She turned to Daniel, eyes shining. I'd like to see that school someday, she said. In time. He squeezed her hand. Me too. Back in her living room, they sat at the old piano. Daniel, who had learned a little in childhood, plunked out a hesitant tune. Diane hummed softly. Paul used to sit there, reading or gently criticizing their attempts at music. For a moment, they felt his presence. Warm, forgiven, at peace. The phone rang, startling them from reverie. Diane answered. It was Harriet, confirming that the reparation and acknowledgement ceremony was set to become an annual event in Vietnam, a symbol of unity and a memorial for those lost. Your presence is always welcome, Harriet said. Diane smiled gently. Not this year, but soon, she replied. Thank you for everything. The following week, a quiet hush settled. Diane found herself able to sleep through the night without nightmares. The once monstrous secret had been named, confronted. The unstoppable guilt that weighed on Paul's soul had found an outlet in the truth. She touched the place where the safe had been hidden in the attic, now empty except for a small keepsake box. Inside were a few photos of her and Paul during happier times, plus a letter she'd written, summarizing her stance on the war crime. She planned to eventually send it to Harriet as part of the official record, her words acknowledging Paul's wrongdoing and his heartfelt remorse, praising his lifetime of seeking redemption through teaching and community service. She still debated whether to make it public or keep it for future historians to find. Perhaps she would let time decide. Summer arrived, gentle and warm, the Vermont hills ablaze with wildflowers. Diane took comfort in the slow rhythms of rural life, greeting neighbors at the farmer's market, occasionally stumbling upon new acquaintances who recognized her as the widow from the Echo-Lantern story. Mostly, they approached with sympathy or curiosity. She discovered she could speak calmly about it now, no longer racked by shame. She told them her husband was a good man who did a terrible thing under orders, and that it was never too late to speak the truth. One lazy afternoon, she brewed sweet tea and sat on the porch with Daniel. They gazed at the sky, conversation meandering from updates on his writing to small anecdotes about Paul's quirks. Laughter bubbled up when they recalled how Paul used to scold them for wearing shoes in the house. Then Daniel's face grew serious. I'm proud of him, you know, he said. Even with all that horror, he carried guilt, but he taught people to be better, to learn from history's mistakes. And in the end, he found a way to speak. Diane swallowed a lump in her throat. He left it for me to find, trusting I'd do the right thing, she whispered. That's love, in a twisted sense. She wiped her eyes. I just wish he could have told me face to face. Daniel nodded, voice quiet. He wanted to, but fear stops good men from doing a lot of things. Fear of losing what little piece they've built. They lapsed into silence, the hum of cicadas filling the air. Diane closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her cheeks. She felt Paul's spirit in the breeze, no longer weighted by secrets, urging her to keep living, keep telling the story that might help others. She resolved to keep volunteering at the Veterans Center, to remain a steady presence for those who wrestled with invisible battles. Each time she heard a veteran's guilt-laden confession, she remembered Paul's journal and how a single voice could break decades of silence. The seasons turned again. Autumn leaves drifted across the yard, gold and red. Diane helped plan a small local event commemorating the Vietnam War's overlooked victims. Harriet visited, giving an update that the official government commission had completed its review. The final documents confirmed Echo Lantern as a clandestine operation resulting in at least 70 civilian deaths. The U.S. would formally include it in a forthcoming retrospective on Vietnam War atrocities. Families, including Lon, had been recognized and financially compensated. More importantly, the public record now carried the truth. Diane found solace in each layer of acknowledgement. No longer was Paul's story hidden behind a false wall or locked safe. It had stepped out into the open, forcing the country to confront one more dark chapter. And if that confrontation saved even one future soldier from facing the same moral trap, or one victim from eternal anonymity, then Paul's confession had served a purpose. Finally, the day came for Diane to pack up some of the lingering boxes, left over from the swirl of media attention. She placed them in a storage closet, articles about Echo Lantern, copies of Daniel's draft manuscript, letters from unknown supporters. She kept the memorial stone in the yard polished, the garden carefully tended. She paused there often, remembering Paul's gentle smile, his stoic manner that now made sense in the context of all he'd buried. She let tears fall, not from heartbreak alone but from a wistful gratitude that the silence had ended. She whispered, "We did what was right, my love." Daniel eventually found a publisher for his book, The Echo Lantern Papers, set to release in the next year. Early reviews praised its candid portrayal of moral complexity and historical reckoning. He dedicated it to Paul, describing him as both soldier and scholar, flawed but not irredeemable. Harriet praised the manuscript, calling it a vital addition to the war's historical record. Diane read an advance copy, tears flowing at how her son captured the nuance of a man shaped by tragedy, yet determined to impart better lessons. She wished Paul could read it. On a crisp morning, Diane received a final letter from Lon. Inside was a photograph of the new village school, children playing in the courtyard with bright smiles. The memorial tree stood tall, leaves shading the plaque that bore Paul's confession, admitting the massacre, naming the date, offering a vow never to forget. Lon wrote that the children were learning English and some read about Paul's story in a simplified format, asking questions about forgiveness and healing. Diane clutched the photo, imagining small footsteps echoing in that courtyard, life blossoming where once there was heartbreak. She stepped out onto her porch, the letter in hand. The sun bathed the horizon in gold. The memory of Paul's voice seemed to whisper on the breeze, reminding her that a single choice, her decision to reveal the journal, had changed so much. Sighing, she closed her eyes, letting the warmth soothe her. In the distance, she heard the rustle of the pine trees, the slow approach of a postal truck. Life continued. She inhaled, feeling a new sense of purpose. She might travel to that village again soon, stand with Lon, maybe watch the children laugh under the same sky that once witnessed unspeakable violence. She felt certain that was what Paul would have wanted. In that moment, it no longer mattered that some corners of the internet still argued over Paul's character or that certain hawks viewed him as a traitor. The only thing that mattered was that truth had emerged, that victims had a voice, and that even after decades, a measure of redemption was possible. Diane turned, heading inside. She had an appointment at the Veterans Center, and she couldn't be late. The men and women there counted on her to show up, to listen, and to remind them that every confession of regret, every haunted memory, could be the first step toward healing. Though Paul's hidden war crime nearly shattered her world, it also forged a stronger bond with Daniel, ignited a national conversation about accountability, and allowed a small village in Vietnam to finally receive recognition for their losses. Through heartbreak came a fragile but profound sense of hope. Diane had found a new calling, helping others carry their own truths into the light. And if that calling was born from tragedy, it was also nurtured by love, a testament to how even the darkest secret might yield seeds of growth. She paused, hand on the doorknob, looking over her shoulder at the yard, where she and Paul once sipped iced tea on warm afternoons. "Thank you," she whispered to the memory of him, voice trembling yet determined, "for trusting me with this, for letting me do what you couldn't." Then she stepped inside, closed the door gently, and moved forward into a day that dawned brighter than the last. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.